Zenaida Gould. I'm the interim executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. I'm also the earlier founding director of the Museo del West Side, and I'm a member of the West Side Preservation Alliance, which is San Antonio's leader in grassroots historic preservation advocacy. Next slide, please. Tonight is the second event of our 2020 Emma Tenayuca Speaker Series, formerly called the West Side Community History and Preservation Speaker Series, which highlights innovative work in community history, historic preservation, and social justice. Next slide, please. The next event in this series will be the West Side History Symposium, which will be presented online on Saturday, October the 3rd. It's free, and we hope you can join us. Next slide. I also want to share that today, a new exhibit launched online, Women and Activism in the West Side. The exhibit is available at museodelwestside.org. This online exhibit will grow over time, and viewers are encouraged to submit stories to include in the exhibit. I just want to say that this exhibit came out of a desire to expand this year's commemoration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment to include women of color, and especially women of the West Side, because our rights don't stop and start with voting, although that's certainly very important. And our civic activism doesn't stop and start with voting, although very important. Next slide, please. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Antonia Castañeda, retired professor of history from St. Mary's University in Texas. She previously held appointments at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Texas at Austin. She remains an active scholar and public historian, as an executive committee member, actually I should say a board member of Latinos in Heritage Conservation, as well as a board member of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. She is also a founding member of San Antonio's West Side Preservation Alliance. In 2011, Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar appointed her to the American Latino Scholars Expert Panel. I also want to highlight one of her many publications, her landmark 1998 study of Latino historic sites in California, which is titled 5 Views, an ethnic historic site survey for California. You can find copies of it online. It's really a landmark document. I encourage you all to check it out. Now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Castañeda. Thank you.
Buenas noches, everybody, and welcome. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome Dr. Cynthia E. Orozco to the Emma Tenayuca Speaker Series and to introduce her. Dr. Orozco of Cuero, Texas, is the daughter of Mexican immigrants, Aurora and Primitivo Orozco. She is a historian, writer, and film and museum consultant, and 2-time Ford Fellow. She is a public historian and a public intellectual. Dr. Orozco, who earned her BA from UT Austin and MA and PhD from UCLA, is professor of history and humanities at Eastern New Mexico University in Ruidoso. A prolific scholar, Orozco is the author of Agents of Change, Adela Sloss-Vento, Mexican-American civil rights activist and Texas feminist. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Which is the basis for tonight's Plática. She is also the author of No Mexicans, Women, or Dogs Allowed. Next slide. The Rise of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, co-editor of Mexican Americans in Texas History, and of the forthcoming biography, next slide, pioneer of Mexican-American civil rights, Alonso Esperales, that will be published by Arte Público Press in the fall of 2020. Orozco wrote 80 encyclopedia articles for the Handbook of Texas and over 100 articles and letters appearing in newspapers in Texas, California, and New Mexico. She has also appeared on C-SPAN Book TV. Orozco served as campaign manager for the Leo Martinez congressional race in the early 2000s. She was a board member of Unladylike 2020, a multimedia project celebrating women of the progressive era in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, which appeared in PBS earlier this month. A pivotal founder of the field of Chicana studies and Chicano history, Orozco is also a founder of the Chicana Caucus of the National Association of Chicano Studies. When asked about her academic, scholarly, and activist trajectory, Dr. Orozco simply responded, quote, "I work to make a difference wherever I live," unquote. And make a difference she has. Dr. Orozco's foundational scholarship centers gender as well as race and class with respect to Mexican American and Mexican women in civil rights history writ large, in the history of LULAC, and in Chicana history. Her examination of the everyday life of a middle-class Mexican American woman provides new understanding of how women have shaped community concerns into political issues, thereby creating and bringing new knowledge about gender, race, and class in the political history of Mexican Americans in Texas and in the United States to the forefront. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Cynthia Orozco to the Emma Tenayuca Speaker Series for her Plática, quote, "Did Suffrage Matter to Tejanas Before and After 1920? The Case of Adela Sloss-Vento." Dr. Orozco.
Thank you, Antonia. It's very much a pleasure to have you introduce me. We've been colleagues for so many years. Likewise, I'd like to thank the Esperanza Center for the opportunity to share what I know about suffrage as well as about the life of Adela Sloss-Vento. As mentioned, I have written a book on Adela Sloss-Vento, who was born around 1901 and died in 1998. She is mostly unknown to the majority of people in the United States and elsewhere, but she's a very important and major civil rights activist, leader, and public intellectual. And I'm hoping tonight to talk a little bit about whether or not suffrage mattered to Tejanas and how it mattered in the life of Adela Sloss-Vento. In order to talk a little bit about the question of suffrage, we really have to talk not just about Texas, but also, we're going to hold on the slides for a little bit, please. We're going to talk a little bit about what was happening elsewhere. And so, as mentioned, in Texas, the situation is probably most like any other place. But in New Mexico, for example, what many people, especially people in Texas and outside of New Mexico, did not realize that 1/3 of the Constitution were actually Hispanos, or that's what they would call it at the time. So that Constitution did not seek to disenfranchise Hispanic or Hispano men at the time. Also, what many people are aware of is in New Mexico, for example, Aurora Lucero, also Soledad Chavez Chacon, and Adelina Otero Warren were three major suffragists active in New Mexico. Chacon actually was the first woman lieutenant governor, and she was actually the first acting woman governor in the entire United States. Adelina Otero Warren was active with the Women's Party connected to Alice Hall and actually ran for Congress in the 1920s. So New Mexico is very different from Texas. We have had three New Mexican women governors, Chavez Chacon, Susana Martinez, who was a Tejana Republican. She had to move to New Mexico to get elected to that position. And Michelle Lujan Grisham, who is a Democrat and our current governor. So the situation then, or question as to whether suffrage mattered, really has to do with what kind of opportunities were there for participation and what kind of obstacles existed for people. If we're talking about that, we can very quickly, if we're looking at, say, the decades of the 1900s, we can refer to women like Teresa and Adela, Sara Estela Ramirez, and the women connected to what was called the Partido Liberal Mexicano, which was the radical party that was both in Mexico and in the United States, and many of their chapters actually in rural communities. When we talk about suffrage as it relates to Texas, it is important to understand that women in Texas did not just care about Texas, they were also recall that Porfirio Diaz had been president in Mexico for decades, became a dictator, and Mexican people in Mexico and Mexican descent people in Texas wanted them out. So those women who were involved in efforts to get Porfirio Diaz out of office, we should call them women suffragists, even if they're arguing that it is men's right to have effective suffrage in Mexico. They are fighting for that while they're living in Texas at the time. I should also mention that in California, for example, we had a few very unusual women, active women, such as Selena Solomons, who was a Sephardic Jew in the San Francisco area, who participated in a group called Voters for Women Club. Also in the Los Angeles, we had a woman named Maria Lopez Luther, who was with an organization called the Los Angeles Political Equality League. And think about how it was so necessary for somebody to do translation work in order to promote suffrage amongst the Spanish-speaking community. So we have had a few exceptional women who were able to break barriers, who also operated independently, arguing for suffrage, whether it was for men or for women. But let's focus on some of the barriers to suffrage, especially in Texas. First of all, there was the poll tax. The poll tax existed from around 1903 to 1965. There were also literacy tests. There were language barriers. Many people do not realize that before World War I, there were Spanish language ballots. But after World War I and the U.S. patriotism, English only, that emerged out of that, bilingual ballots disappear, and they're going to disappear until the 1970s. Also, political Marxism was a major problem because white employers had control over their Mexican workers, and they would often buy the poll tax and get their employees to work. To vote, and to vote the way they wanted them to vote. Also, for women, there was also the loss of citizenship for any Mexican-American woman who married, and actually this is in the entire United States. There's something called the 1907 Expatriation Act, which lasts from 1907 to 1922. And if you were a U.S. citizen and married a so-called foreigner, you would lose your citizenship. So that means if a Mexican-American woman married a Mexican, that she no longer had U.S. citizenship. Also, there's that big problem that we've known forever and for so long, sexism. Thinking that women's place really is the home and not in politics. And then, of course, you need to have educated people in order to have effective suffrage. And of course, we had so many obstacles to education. So then, those are some of the general barriers that existed. But what I'd like to do now is focus on Adela Sloss-Vento and talk about the many interventions that she made in order to advance suffrage. Now, recall that she is born around 1901, so she would have been 19 or 20 around the time that suffrage for women passed in 1920. But she would have been a young, thinking adult. Now, what we also know about her is that she didn't finish high school until she was probably around 25, 26 because she belonged to a working class family and had to work. Nonetheless, we know that in high school she said she was involved in a political club. So we know she is benefiting from women's suffrage, from discussions about women's suffrage, and she is a very intelligent woman. Now recall that it is not common for Mexican Americans, and especially women, to become high school graduates probably till the 1950s. And so she is highly unusual in her time, and that's really what makes her different. So I want to talk to you about her as a feminist, as a suffragist, as a public intellectual, a civil rights leader, and actually also as a Democrat. And I'll talk about the idea of her as a Democrat in two ways. I'll talk about her as a member of the Democratic Party, but I'll also talk about her as a Democrat with a small d, and how she advocated for Mexico's empowerment and how stopping immigration might help Mexico. And so it's quite fascinating. For those who are interested in my book, you can dwell further into some of the theoretical discussions. I talk about the problem of what I call, or what we call, homosociality, the idea of men working with men, women working with women. I also talk about Adela Sloss-Vento taking advantage of what is called modern gender selfhood. I also talk about the idea of how she participated in something that we call earth-based feminism. So again, those who want to dwell further can do so. But before we talk a little bit about her, let's talk about the general political status of the Mexican descent community in Texas. First of all, if we look at the political status of the Mexican descent people, if we look at the year 1911, there is one Tejano, just one man who is in the state legislature, and that is it. We don't have any more representation. Between 1920 and 1950, there are two Tejanos in the Texas state legislature. In 1969, there are only 12. So you see, we barely have decent representation of men, of Mexican descent men, Mexican American men in our Texas legislature. If we look also at the question of the class status of the Mexican descent community, around 1930, about half of our community are farm workers. Our middle class is very small, our upper class is very, very tiny. Really, it's not until after World War II that our economic status really begins to improve a little bit. If we look at the social and cultural status of our community, we understand that racial segregation is on the rise. And so, for example, in 1948, there were still 139 school districts that were segregated. And perhaps more importantly, what was going on is that segregation was everywhere. And I want everyone to take a look at the sign that I'm raising right now. And this sign is a real sign. It says, "No dogs, Negroes, Mexicans." This was 1942, and it came out of Dallas. But those kinds of signs would have been seen by your probably grandparents by now and were common up and through the late 60s. So you see our situation. In terms of education, in the year 1930, only 250 Latinos were at UT Austin. In 1946, in the entire state, only 114 were in college. So really, it's not until the ethnic studies movements, the Chicano movement, the rise of financial aid, that we really started to change our status through college. Again, I argue that she is a feminist. One of the most interesting things that Adela Sloss-Vento, who is from San Juan and is both from San Juan and spends a good amount of time in Edinburgh, is a feminist. And in the 1930s, she wrote a very interesting article for the LULAC News. LULAC is League of United Latin American Citizens, and it is the oldest Latino civil rights organization in the country, founded in 1929, and she was intimately involved with some of its leadership. So her article titled Why There Is No Happiness in Many Latino Homes. And this is in 1934. And again, she talks about male privilege and that Latino men have all privilege. So we know through her words and through her actions that she is a feminist. I might also say that she partakes of two major social movements. She participates in what we call the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, which starts around 1920 in Texas, and also the Chicano movement, which begins in the early 60s as well. Along with Adela Sloss-Vento, the other major feminist that I have identified that is in the LULAC organization is a woman named Alice Dickerson Montemayor of Laredo, ever met, but they were both distinctive in the way that they worked. So what we see then is the LULAC organization is created in 1929, but it does not allow women to join. And it's going to be a few years before LULAC officially allows women. Those women are only allowed in separate chapters that they call Ladies LULAC. So the common way that Mexican American women would have participated in civic activity that was politically engaged would have been Ladies LULAC from the 1930s all the way to the 70s. After the 70s, because of the women's movement and because culture is changing, we start to get mixed gender councils with both men and women. But again, these two women mostly worked independently, but both would have argued for the poll tax. Paying poll tax is key to having true women's suffrage. You have to be able to pay your poll tax. You have to have an independent ability to exercise your political rights in order to have power for our community. Now, she was a prolific writer, and the reason most people don't know about her is because her papers are still in the hands of her son, Dr. Arnoldo Bento. And I was fortunate to meet him at the University of Texas in 1978. And he actually introduced me to her. So I met her, I got to know her peripherally, but we were not able to see her significance until her papers were available to me. And Dr. Vento has written the first book about her. That book is available on the internet. Mine is actually the second book about her. Let me read to you what she said about the poll tax. And this is something she wrote in the 40s. We should not permit anyone to pay our poll tax. We will not allow our people to be tied down. We live in a democratic and free country, and as such, we should be free citizens. We need to realize that the vote is a powerful weapon through which we can elect representatives that can assist us in solving our problems. When people are allowed to be deceived or to have their votes misdirected, he or she is causing harm not only to themselves, but to their children and the Latin American community in general. It is not sufficient to pay the poll tax. It is requisite to be well informed on politics, but one that is not directed on leaders who have personal interests. But you can definitely see she understands the power of the vote, the need to pay the poll tax, and the need to have an independent electorate. She also writes about organizing, and we know that one of the major things that she did was organize an independent political club in the Valley and the McAllen area, and this is what she wrote. We should organize political clubs in all of the barrios towns. They should be by the people and for the people, and may those who choose its leaders or directors be sincere, patriotic, and ask only for the rights and justice of the people. We should be aware that while our people are deceived, confused, divided, without proper information and through choice, we cannot solve our problems that impede our social and economic evolution. While this exists, we cannot hope for the betterment of the Latin American people. So you can see she is very much an articulate intellectual. Now, I do talk about her as a civil rights activist, and I might mention that she played a fundraising role in the first desegregation of a Mexican school in Del Rio, Texas in the early 30s, the Del Rio versus Salvatierra. She also was active lobbying the state legislature through letters to try to get anti-discrimination bills. She also played an important role in calling for the non-exploitation of braceros being Mexican immigrant workers who were allowed into the United States between 1942 and 1964. And she all protested a racist publication printed by UT Austin in 1951 called The Wetback in the Lower Rio Grande. Now again, recall that the federal government, the U.S. government, openly called Mexican immigrants wetbacks, and this was the common nature of racism still in the 1950s. We also know that she was active in the Chicano movement. She was in favor of the Raza Unida Party. She wrote letters in favor of the United Farm Workers and the Texas Farm Workers. She also supported the student radicals who walked out at Ed Couch Elsa. And again, this is a new tactic by youth. It's a walkout. So she spans these two movements. She also supports Chicano studies at the university and promotes the Spanish language, which had been in decline by that time. So we also know she's a public intellectual. Again, she writes in newspapers from 1927 to 1978. First, she mostly writes in Spanish, but by the 50s, she was writing more in English. Mostly when she wrote in Spanish, she wrote to the La Prensa newspaper, which existed from around 1913 to 1960, and really which was at the level of the New York Times in Spanish. It was worldly, it was international, but it reached to the little bitty towns throughout Texas and other places. So it really is a worldly newspaper. She also wrote in English for the McAllen Monitor, the Harlingen Star, the Brownsville Herald, and she writes op-eds and letters to the editor. And I might also mention that during World War II, she writes anti-fascist articles. So she is quite interesting. Nonetheless, one of the things I talk about in the book is that she has what I call gendered ambivalence. In other words, she doesn't really give herself credit. She writes in third person, she uses pseudonyms, she uses all kinds of variations of her name, and more importantly than anything, she does not credit herself. And again, I suspect that as a Mexican woman, especially in this pre-Chicano movement, pre-women's liberation era, it is so common for women to not give themselves credit, but she is highly, highly unusual. Finally, I want to talk to you about her as a Democrat. And again, we see through her correspondence that she writes the presidents of the United States. Now think about how interesting, how unusual this is, because even today, only 10% of all Americans ever write a public official. And again, remember in the old days, people had to write with hand or with the typewriter. It's not as easy. Today you can send a quick email, but there's so many emails it doesn't stand out. Okay, so she wrote FDR, Roosevelt in the 30s, Truman, Kennedy, LBJ, and Carter. She also played an active role in a 1948 US Senate race in the Valley. And as I mentioned, she is a founder and president of what they call the Independent Citizens Political Club in the Valley, and focus again on independent. It's not Democrat, it's not Republican, and basically they're promoting the poll tax, they're telling people to get out and vote, and they're trying to elect Mexican Americans to office. Also, while she proclaimed herself to be a Democrat, she still wrote letters in favor of the Raza Unida Party, which was a third political party that was founded in the 60s, and really is key to understanding why Latinos have any kind of place in the Democratic Party today. The true origins of that transition, it's all about the Raza Unida Party. And again, think of somebody like Rosie Castro and how that has led to Joaquin Castro. Also, I mentioned that she's a Democrat with a small d. because she writes also to presidents of Mexico, mostly talking about the problem of immigration. And she does see it as a problem, but mostly she's talking about how the immigrants are exploited, and she's also talking about the forced migration of Tejanos who cannot compete with Mexican immigrants. So that is my talk, but now what I'd like to do is share the PowerPoint with you. So if we could go to the PowerPoint. Again, so Adela Sloss-Vento, her life basically spans most of the 20th century. Next. And here's a picture of her when she graduated. Again, she was already kind of in her mid-20s, but a very bright, articulate person. And her Anglo peers at the time saw her as bright and intelligent, but they still wondered what was a Mexican doing in their class. Next. And again, these are the major things that I talk about her in the book that we've talked about already: a civil rights leader, intellectual, democratic, feminist. Next. And we've talked a little bit about the racial context. Next. Again, here's the sign. This is one of the most commonly used signs when we talk about racial segregation. And this is not just in Texas. I've studied some of New Mexico. Southern New Mexico, eastern New Mexico would have also seen this kind of things, as well as other places in the United States. Next. Here's a sign specifically from San Antonio. I always tell folks this shows ignorance on 3 levels. Number 1, it says "we serve whites," apostrophe only, so these people or this person cannot spell. Secondly, it's racist. And thirdly, if this is at a business, the business owner is losing big money by not serving the Mexican clientele. Next. Again, we've talked a little bit about the gendered context. Next. The photographs that follow really show you how unusual Adela Sloss-Vento. This photo of LULAC in 1929, its founders, shows they're all men. Next. This photo of the La Prensa newspaper in 1929 is also shocking because there is not a single woman on the La Prensa staff. There's probably, I don't know, 75, 100 men here. Next. Here we see a picture of Tejano attorneys in 1954 celebrating the Hernandez case that went to the Supreme Court. There is one Tejana lawyer from Farfurias in the late 50s. The next one is going to be around 1969. And really, we have no women lawyers until the 70s, 80s, and thereafter. Next. Now, Adela Sloss-Vento married her husband, Pedro Vento. He's seated on the left, the front row. Now, this is what I call a modern man because he was able to deal with Adela Sloss-Vento and her strength and intelligence. He was the head jailer and later became a U.S. Marshal. But she also started working at the jail as a jail matron, especially when there were braceras, women immigrants, that were being caught in the valley area. So even at the workplace, she worked with men. Next. Next, we're going to move across her life, various decades. In the 1920s, next. This is a picture of, this is actually a racially integrated class of white people and a few Mexican descent people. And she is the last person, second row. So this is unusual that it's an integrated class. Next. This is a copy of a newspaper in 1927. One of the things about her is that she started to collect newspaper articles, particularly about a very important conference that was held in Harlingen, Texas, to discuss the formation of a major statewide civil rights organization for Mexican descent people. The question was whether or not Mexican immigrants would be admitted. It was decided they would not be admitted, but also women were not allowed at that convention, so Adela Sloss-Vento was not admitted either. Next. Here again is the same picture of LULAC that was formed 2 years after the Harlingen Convention. It was the result of the Harlingen Convention. And finally, they were united, but only Mexican Americans and only men. Next. Now, this is Alonso Perales, who really is the true principal founder of the LULAC, because dating back to 1920, there was another statewide organization called the Order Sons of America, again, men only. But he saw problems with that organization, and he is really the key leader who is trying to form the LULAC organization. And Adela Sloss-Vento